Welcome to the Saturday Cup of Joe from Detroit, week 256. I got my cup of Joe here. Detroit hustles harder. Happy Easter, happy Passover if you're celebrating or worshiping this weekend. I hope you have a wonderful weekend with family or friends. I had a couple of different articles, well, a couple. If you've ever seen my Chrome browser, I have anywhere from 17 to 20 to 30 to 40 different tabs open. All the articles I want to read, all the things I'm thinking about. But the some of the things that popped up this week I thought were really interesting were around housing supply and housing demand. And there's a lot going on in competition in housing markets. And one of the things we'll talk about is just how that affects the market, how it actually can affect the policy, frankly. I wanted to talk a little bit about this really interesting business deal. States Title is a title company that has been making a lot of waves for being an innovator and a disruptor in the title industry. And a couple of articles got posted this week about the way in which their growth happened as a startup. And I think it's pretty creative and innovative. So a little bit of innovation in housing, a little bit of innovation, in deal structure. And then last, there was just a lot going on in my world about green energy efficiency and whether it's green mortgages, green housing. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about because there was an article that came across about misinformation on climate change, and I felt like it all wrapped together. But first, there was a CNN.com cover story, and now it's making the rounds about this house in suburban DC that had 88 offers on the home, 76 of which were all cash. So if you imagine these urban legends that go around in real estate from time to time about I had 8 offers in the first 12 hours or 10 offers in the first 24 hours. I got all cash offers. And, there was one urban legend a while ago in Idaho, the hot market in the midst of the pandemic in Idaho. There's 300 offers on a house. This one on CNN, which I'll link to, had 76 all cash offers. And I think it goes to a couple of things. One, perceptions of cash instead of perceptions of certainty. Cash is seen still as king in the real estate market, but it's really a perception versus reality story because sometimes a cash offer is not all it's cracked up to be. As you can imagine, cash can have its own delays. You can be nickel and diming the inspection, and there can be a lot of tension or disagreement or renegotiation around the inspection. That can throw a cash offer into sort of the 30, 40, 50-day time frame, whereas financed, a verified certain sort of mortgage offer can actually come in under cash at times. I think the other thing that throws cash off from time to time from being faster is not everybody has the cash all in one spot. Pretty much cash buyers have to collect it, have to get the cash ready, to be transmitted or wired to the table. And so just something to think about there is this hot market. Will we see increasing cash offers? We've already seen platforms stepping up to try to help any buyer become a cash buyer, just retiming the transaction or bringing in cash and then backfilling it with a mortgage, this type of thing. So I wanted to link to that because I thought that was a really good way to kick off just how hot the market is, how much demand there is, but then also what a little bit of perception versus reality. The other thing that I think was really interesting this week that caught my attention in terms of housing innovation was housing as infrastructure. I've been saying for a while that I think housing in a community, single family home, first time home buyer, does go to the both physical and economic infrastructure of our communities, of our cities, of our towns. And so the Biden administration put housing and specifically affordable housing into the infrastructure bill. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Take a look at how it plays out because I think there will be some more details around, using state and local agencies to facilitate the funding, creating incentives, whether those are tax incentives or whether those are true development, redevelopment, or renovation incentives. There's public-private partnerships in there. There's still a lot under the hood to dig into. I don't have all the details on that today, but the concept is what I wanted to talk about because I think the concept plays into a later topic around green housing and the energy efficiency of our housing. But the idea that you're infusing a consumer, you're infusing a homeowner into the economy of a local place. Yes, the asset is there, and there was one homeowner before, and there's a new homeowner now, but it also creates economic activity. So when you think of the flow of money, when you think of support for small businesses or local businesses, creating an empowered consumer, creating stable communities, creating housing stability creates positive economic activity. And it doesn't have to just be paint and dog food and pizza on Friday night, though it is all of those things. It's also about the ability to transact and make choices as a consumer. So as we enable consumer activity, as we get the economy going and try to really infuse support for uh, economic growth, but also economic support for small businesses, one of the best ways to do it is to create more stable consumers. And I think that housing as infrastructure speaks to job creation. It speaks to the economic speed or flow of money. And I'm really excited to think more big picture about how we create jobs, how we create more housing supply out of this infrastructure bill, but just out of housing as infrastructure in general. And then I also wanted to go from big to small. So, of course, that's a big macro policy and economic issue. There was also a profile in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which focused on Nesterly. And Nesterly is a startup that didn't look at housing demand as needing units, literally said, how about bedrooms? Let's look at empty bedrooms. And it turns out from the research, there's 54 million empty bedrooms every night in America. So how do you take a demand for someone looking for a roommate or looking for affordable rent and match them up with an empty bedroom or a place, they could rent? And a lot of those empty bedrooms are in the homes of baby boomers, retirees, and empty nesters. So Nesterly says, why don't we take the demand for a roommate or a bedroom and match it up with those who could use some more income, could use a roommate in the house. And usually we're thinking about roommates as peers. And Nesterly said, no, let's think about roommates as empty bedrooms, and perhaps you have cross-generational roommates. Really interesting way to solve a problem, right? I think that innovative concept, I mentioned it as small, but really effective, really an interesting way to think about it. So I'll link to that if you're wanting to think about empty bedrooms as housing supply in kind of a new way. The CEO writes up her experience. I think it's really cool. And that transition from housing innovation to deal innovation came in the form of this Foundation Capital blog post where Foundation Capital kind of outlined how they helped States Title grow. And what I think is interesting is States Title is a small startup that decided to look at title insurance more like a casualty risk product and say, okay, instead of doing the manufacturing process or underwriting the step by step chain of title review or title exam, what if we looked at title insurance as the likelihood of a claim that disrupts ownership? And then the algorithm would put a risk score on the title insurance, and you could kind of price and deliver title insurance in a new way. So States Title made a lot of sort of waves as being an interesting startup in that regard in an otherwise, big part of the real estate industry. And so Lennar, the home builder, had their own large title insurance group, North American Title. And normally you'd imagine that Lennar, the big player in home builder, the big financier, would take their title group, North American Title, and acquire or assume States Title. But what happened here was they decided that there were aspects of States Title and there were aspects of the leadership group that they wanted to kind of leave independent or leave to continue to grow, to continue to disrupt and innovate. But Lennar wanted in on the innovation. So they actually did a deal where Lennar, the big player, sold North American Title to States Title in exchange for an outsized ownership interest in the company. So it's almost like reverse M&A, but you get the equity in the new startup at a greater share or at a greater size. So the established player goes to the smaller player, and now theoretically everybody benefits. I just like the creative thinking around the deal structure. And I think the entire entity has now rebranded just this week or a week ago as Doma. So I think it'll be Doma Title, or Doma will be the name of the platform that is kind of representing this larger new entity. But I put two links in there just if you're curious about creative deal structure. That one caught my attention. I think it's worth thinking about how maybe that changes the way startups and innovation is viewed, especially if innovation is, inorganic growth where you're, bringing on an acquired company or idea. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier, I wanted to talk a little bit about greenhousing because it keeps coming up. One of the things, though, that I found unrelated to housing was just an interesting article about misperception on social media platforms around, democratic institutions was on display throughout this past election cycle and beyond. And it's also being true globally about climate change. So how climate change is absorbed, how it's understood, how there's trolls or misinformation out there on climate change is found to be true, I guess, on social media platforms, just like it was about like democratic institutions in America during the last election. I don't know if this caught my attention because I've been watching that HBO documentary on QAnon, like the search for Q. Um, and how the conspiracy theorists and the conspiracy theories grew and really morphed into things that were way beyond anything that was in the original posts. But this entire conspiracy theory has popped up, leading all the way to like certain members of Congress and sort of the highest levels of the White House. And when you think about it in the context of climate change or climate risk, it's also true that misperceptions can be out there. And what flipped in this article that I thought was interesting was, there's a certain consumer and user on social media who's always gone to one source for news, whether that's the evening news or the New York Times or NPR. You kind of have your one source of news or one source that you trust. And we're always all talking about coming up, reading different things and kind of triangulating our own beliefs. But one of the things I think is interesting about Facebook is that even though it's one source, it had all of these posts from all different sources. And so it kind of did this weird, maybe subliminal, subconscious flip where you went from your one source, the evening news or New York Times, to Facebook as your one source. But it's not apples to apples, right? Because if you had to think of it as a newspaper, Facebook's like an entire newspaper of letters to the editor, except there's no editor and there's no rhyme or reason uh, to the snippets, right? So if they were all in one place physically, you would look at them as chaos and as no structure and no sort of editorial content or editorial expertise at all. But because they're digital and it's your one source and your network, I think it lends to false credibility in a way that I thought was really interesting in this piece. And the idea that there is climate risk or climate change denial happening, but without reflecting on how that affects our households or us, our individual behavior. It's almost as if I deny the science of climate change, then it alleviates me of responsibility for my land and my home and my car. And I just don't see that connection. That seems like really disconnected to me. And so when I started to think about green housing, energy efficiency in housing, the production line of the sources and materials of how we create more housing supply, both from a housing as infrastructure perspective and then also just generally as we evaluate, I write a lot about ESG. You've heard me talk about environmental social governance ratings and practices of companies. Housing's been largely kind of overlooked in some of those ratings. And I think now's the time to start thinking about green housing and energy efficiency in our communities and our homes on that level, on the individual home level and the production line of home. So a really good friend, Christian Ebersol, is on his own green journey. He wants to launch a company. He's decided to create a blog so follow the research and follow his experience. And I want to link to Into the Green. And you can follow Christian Into the Green and see some of the ways he's looking at both the climate change research and the climate risk, but then also the energy efficiency and innovation that can come in different sectors, whether that's vehicles, farming, housing. He's looking across all of that with the intention of starting a, energy conscious, green conscious company. So definitely, I'm going to put the link there so you can subscribe and follow Christian Into the Green. And that's it for the Saturday Cup of Joe. Have a great weekend. Can't wait to talk to you next week. 4 more weeks and it'll be 5 years of the Saturday Cup of Joe. 260 is 5 years in Detroit, 5 years of the Cup of Joe. So I look forward to talking to you a few times between now and then. Take care.